Hey everyone, I'm Nick Beauchamp. I'm in political science and the Network Science Institute. So I'm probably going to go right off topic on this because it seems like such a nice group for thinking about sort of some of the deeper issues that have been lurking behind a series of projects that I've been doing with some colleagues at University of Michigan, Lu Wang, Frederick Zhang, Ken Zhu, and a few others. All around media bias, but what this has kind of done, at least for me, is kind of drag us into sort of bigger questions of AI bias and even sort of thinking about the human bias. And all of these things kind of lead to deep thoughts about what does bias mean, what does belief mean, how do we think about these sorts of structures in these sorts of entities. So anyway, I've got a long background in text and politics. I've been doing this for 20 years or so in NLP and various other sort of computational approaches to thinking about speeches, debates, belief networks, long-term evolution of hate and social media, and those sorts of things, all using text. And early work in neural networks, including sort of trying to use neural networks to sort of do very, very traditional work in political science, placing bills and members of Congress in sort of ideological spaces, which is kind of the go-to framework that political scientists take as a way of trying to model, how people vote on things, which is in some ways like, okay, let's reinvent the wheel in using AI or neural networks and then sort of move forward from there. And so I'm going to kind of come back to this at the end if I don't run out of time, because part of this line of work, which I've kind of gotten back into recently, that I've been thinking about is how all of these models, whether applied to media, whether applied to LLMs, whether applied to humans, are deeply simplistic and missing the level of structure that we need to sort of understand how these things are working. And old generative stuff with LSTMs, which again, everyone thinks that there's like this huge revolution in producing speech, but at least with certain types of things like formatted stuff, the old neural networks could still produce vaguely plausible garbage like this bill here. All right, so when LLMs, the revolution happened, and I guess attention is all you need, and then sort of the GPT release and so forth, I, like many other people, started sort of exploring what it meant to think about morals and values and bias in LLMs, and like everyone else, discovered you could replicate a lot of sort of human-based research. This one here is sort of showing how moral values, sort of the relative application of different moral values changed with whether you're conservative or liberal as a human, or whether you just tell the machine that it is a liberal or conservative, and you get very similar results. And there's been lots and lots of papers since this is not even published. It's just something I did for fun. And all of these things kind of raise this kind of question of what's going on inside these black boxes. And so we've been working on sort of the black box of the newsroom in these set of projects, but really it's kind of functionally analogous in many ways to understanding the black box of an LLM or the black box of a brain, in the sense that they're all black boxes. We don't know what's really going on inside these things, and the effort of cracking them open often just reveals information at the wrong scale for being useful. We crack open the brain and see the neurons. That's not the scale that we're thinking ideas operate at. We can crack open the LLMs, we can find the words. Now for some things, like what we just saw earlier, you can sort of see the LLM clockwork orange repression working. But in general, cracking them open is a very poor way of understanding like how they're thinking about things. And newsrooms too, there's all sorts of levels, as John knows, that are not very informative, but are kind of cool, and of course you can't usually get them. So this project, as I said, kind of starts with the idea of like, what is media bias? How can we do a better job of measuring this thing? Particularly for someone like me who doesn't really believe in the term bias, he thinks that everything has values. There's no coherent notion, either feasibly or theoretically, of having unbiased media, because again, that's sort of applying a very simplistic framework that is left, right, and then unbiased in the middle, which is wrong in like 4 different ways. So anyway, this has got a long history that I'm not going to reiterate, a series of papers that we've been working on. What makes it kind of interesting for the news in particular is that the news media are still very strongly committed to this idea of nonpartisan news that has no perspective and lets viewers make up their own minds. And so one thing I'm not going to talk about here is, turn that off, that this is just impossible. But what is interesting about it is because they do this, it makes it very hard to figure out what their ideological leanings are because they don't use overt ideological language. So basically in these papers, what we've been doing is we've been taking sort of LLMs since the beginning and then trying to add more human-like structure to them. So we add things like short-term memory, long-term memory. We add things like networks of ideas between entities, where we've got sort of traditional LLM structures, we've got sort of network structures. We're trying to combine these two things as a way of sort of understanding not the sort of overt bias in media, but rather the way that they sort of indirectly show it by expressing positive sentiment towards some entities and negative by others. And again, the sentiment is not even what the newspaper is doing, it's just who they're quoting in various ways. And so this shows various asymmetries between liberal and conservative outlets, where sort of the liberal ones tend to be more similar in their degree of positivity, but different in their degrees of negativity. And the conservative ones tend to be more similar in their negativity, but different in their positivity. So this starts opening up this space of like all the different sort of asymmetries and structural differences that again sort of break out of this unidimensional left-right spectrum. And then in later work we start adding in moral values where again we think, okay, the way humans think about morals is that they often have scenarios, stories, paradigms in mind. They have a set of values, they have all these other pieces of structure. It's not just words to judgments. And so what we're trying to do here is add various structures to the LLMs, such as scenarios in their mind that they sort of think of when they're given a task to evaluate a new scenario and various values associated with it. And again, what we find is that when we combine this with sort of values, which again break up the